All right. Um, I guess if you're watching this, then uh, I'm not there today. Um, I was hoping that I wouldn't have to use it, but I made it just in case because my little fella had a fever last night, and I guess he mustn't be feeling well enough today to go to school or to daycare. Um, anyway, I'm gonna try and do this through a video lesson. Um, Yesterday, you spent some time learning about the brain and the parts of the brain and how they work. So I'm not sure who's going to be in for me today, but I might get them to go around and check and give you credit for having it done. Anyway, we'll start by going over the parts of the brain. Again, the brain is much more complex than what we're going to get into. We're going to look at the cross section of the brain and the parts that we see in the cross section and what their general jobs are. Okay. Um, so if you look, probably the most obvious part is this part up here that looks all kind of coiled up. This is the part that gives us our intelligence, our emotions, our personalities. It controls voluntary movements. There's a lot of stuff that this part of the brain does. This part is, you're right, the cerebrum. Okay, so it's probably easiest to think of what all this part is responsible for when you think of the other diagram that you had to label. So if you think of what all those different lobes of the outer part of this cerebrum do, um, then you can kind of think a little easier of what are its jobs as a whole. Okay, so again, it's responsible for intelligence, personality, voluntary movements. So that includes your speech, memory, hearing, vision, recognition of objects, um, sensing temperature, touch, and taste, all those kinds of things. Okay, so this is the part that makes us so unique compared to other animals. Now, let me see. Can I get a... Where's my... Let's see. What if I... There we go. We'll lock her in place. And maybe my other pen will show up. No, well, at least we get the cursor now. Okay, so this part here that lies kind of underneath the cerebrum, it's actually, you can't really tell from this view, but it's kind of a nerve stalk, and it goes from one side of the brain to the other. So it is called the corpus callosum. You're right. Okay, so its job, it acts like a bridge between the left and right sides of the cerebrum. So the left and right cerebral hemispheres, like we call them. Just below that is one of those spaces that we talked about yesterday. It's called the lateral ventricle. And it is going to hold within it some cerebral spinal fluid, and it also helps to produce cerebral spinal fluid. Now, we're going to look and see this this part down here. I'm hoping you can see my little cursor on top of it. This is actually not technically a part of the brain. It is a special gland, and it gives you kind of an icon to look for to help figure out the other parts of the brain. Okay, so this is actually what we call the master gland. It's known as the pituitary gland, and it's called the master gland because it kind of has control over a lot of other glands. And it's really closely regulated by the part of the brain that's right above it. So if you go up from there, the part that kind of looks after it or controls it is the hypothalamus. And we've heard about the hypothalamus in the last chapter, in regulation of body fluids and things like that. So the hypothalamus is often called the switchboard and the master switchboard because it kind of connects the brain and the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, and the pituitary gland is often called the master gland because it controls a lot of the other glands. Okay, so what are some of the other things that the hypothalamus is responsible for? Um, it is the center of taste. Oh, sorry, not taste, sorry. Center of thirst and hunger, center of pain and pleasure, the center of body temperature, metabolism, water balance, and even aggression is to some degree controlled by this part. Okay, so hunger and thirst, pain and pleasure, your body temperature, metabolism, water balance, and aggression are things that tend to be regulated by the hypothalamus. So, hypo tends to mean below. If someone is, um, let's see, if they're hypersensitive to something, then they're more sensitive than normal to it. If they're hyposensitive, then they're less. So it's below normal. So think of it meaning as below, then it's saying it's below the thalamus. So if we look, follow this from here and we go upwards, this part here, which is kind of above and back from it, is the thalamus. Okay, so the thalamus is a relay station, kind of. It helps to sort sensory and motor information as it's passing through the brain. All right, now this little part we talked about briefly yesterday. It's kind of located between the forebrain and the hindbrain, so it is the midbrain. The midbrain helps to relay information about auditory and visual reflexes, so it helps to kind of moderate some of your reflexes. This part that looks kind of like a bush, it's located at the back, so it's kind of, it helps to orient you when you're looking at pictures of the brain like this. If you see this part, then you know it's at the back. So this part over here is at the front. So it looks kind of like a bush. It is known as the cerebellum. You need to be able to tell the difference between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebrum is that bigger part that's all kind of convoluted, and it looks after our intelligence, our, all those things that tend to make us more special as humans. Okay, um, the cerebellum, its job is to help control our balance, our coordination, our posture, muscle tone. So it doesn't necessarily control the movement that you're actually going to move, but it helps to make those movements smoother. Okay, help you with your balance, coordination, and keep your movements smoother. All right, so over here, this part right here is called the pons. And if you were in French, you would say pont. And pont stands for, anybody know? Yeah, it stands for bridge. Okay, so up here we talked about the corpus callosum as being a bridge between the left and right cerebral halves, cerebral hemispheres. The pons is a bridge that forms between the left and right. It kind of connects the left and right sides of the cerebellum, but it also connects them um, to the medulla oblongata. Okay, so it acts like a bridge between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata, which is just below the pons. Okay, so here's the medulla oblongata. Now, if you took grade 11 biology, then you'll remember us talking a bit about the medulla oblongata. And this is the part of the brain that is so critical, so vital for us to survive, because it is the part that looks after your vital, your life support functions. Okay, if you had to be put on a life support machine, it's because this part of the brain isn't able to do its job at the time. Okay, maybe there's swelling there, or maybe there's injury there, but the medulla oblongata is responsible for things like your heartbeat, the rate of your heartbeat, your breathing and breathing rates. It also looks after involuntary movements like um, movement of blood through your blood vessels, okay, movement of food through your digestive tract, all those kinds of things we don't tend to think about are controlled by the medulla oblongata. Okay, it also regulates the blood vessel diameter. So it is a really critical part of how we work, how we function, and that we can actually survive or live. Okay, and although it's not, I put it in a different color because it's not really part of the brain, it's good to know where this connects. It connects just below the medulla oblongata. So spinal cord, which is the other part of the central nervous system. Okay, and I've already uploaded this video, I guess, since you're watching it. I've uploaded it to YouTube, so if you need to watch it again, then it'll be there for you to watch online if you've missed any of the parts and what they do. Okay, you may have done this activity yesterday, but basically it was to highlight the fact that your left and right sides of the cerebrum, or your left and right cerebral hemispheres, I thought to kind of control different aspects of how we think and work, and what our thought processes are, or what our strengths are too. So sometimes when someone is said to be more mathematical or science oriented, then we say, oh, well, they are left brain dominant. Okay, if they tend to be more artistic, creative, intuitive about things, musical, then we say that they tend to be more right side dominant. So the little activity that you did yesterday, or maybe you're going to get to do it today, do it after this video probably. It's just a fun little activity to kind of see if you tend to be more left or more right brain dominant. Okay, is it really holding true if you do this little test? Well, no, not really. And some of us are, we seem to have strengths on both sides. So for some, you're not necessarily one side dominant over the other. Okay, but here's a little video you can watch. And you may need to turn the sound down because sometimes these get pretty loud.
The brain is composed of more than 1,000 million neurons. Specific groups of them, working in concert, provide us with the capacity to reason, to experience feelings, and to understand the world. They also give us the capacity to remember numerous pieces of information. There are three major components of the brain: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Here is the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex is the outside portion of the cerebrum, also called the gray matter. It generates the most complex intellectual thoughts and controls body movement. The cerebrum is divided into left and right sides, which communicate with each other through a thin stalk of nerve fibers. The group.
Do you remember what that was called? The stalk of nerve fibers that connects the left and right sides? Right on. corpus callosum.
Both of the cerebral hemispheres look similar, but each helps us to perform different functions. The left side of the brain is thought to be more influential in shaping reasoning and language, as well as scientific and mathematical skills. The right side of the brain is believed to have more influence over art and music, as well as insight and imagination. The left hemisphere controls the muscles of the right foot, while the right hemisphere controls the muscles of the left foot. In other words, the left side of the brain controls the muscles on the right side of the body, and vice versa. Voluntary body movements are controlled by a region of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is also where we shape emotional reactions and expressions. Now, let's take a look at the parietal lobe. There are two parietal lobes, one on each side of the brain. The taste center is located in the parietal lobes. Here is one of the paired temporal lobes. All of the sounds that we hear are processed in the temporal lobe. They are also important for learning, memory, and emotion. The occipital lobe analyzes visual information from the retina and makes us aware of what we are seeing. If the occipital lobe becomes damaged, a person could become blind, even if his or her eyes continue to function normally. The cerebellum creates automatic programs so we can make complex movements without thinking. And here is the brainstem. It is critical for survival because it connects the brain with the spinal cord. The top portion of the brainstem is called the midbrain. Just below it is the pons, and below that is the medulla. The medulla, with its critical functions, lies deep within the head, where it is well protected from injuries by an extra thick section of overlying skull. When we are asleep or unconscious, our heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure continue to function because they're regulated by the medulla. And that concludes a general overview of the components of the brain.
Okay, so one of the questions that you had yesterday that I asked you to try and find out was, what are the three parts that make up the brainstem? Okay, so starting from the most anterior or most upper part would be the midbrain, and just below it, you can look on your, let's see, look on your diagram. Okay, here's the midbrain, the pons, and below that, the medulla oblongata. So these three parts are referred together as the brainstem, and they connect the rest of the brain with the spinal cord. Okay, so if you have damage to the brainstem, because the medulla oblongata is in there, then it can be a really serious, life-threatening injury. Okay, so that's the left and right hemispheres. If you take a closer look at the cerebrum, it's the outer region. It's only about 1/4 of an inch thick, okay? But the outer region, the cortex, that is performing all these tasks or looking after all these tasks for us. Okay, so we're going to look at it and its lobes a little more closely. If you look at it, it looks all kind of curvy. Okay, that's we use the word convoluted to show that it's all kind of coiled up. And the reason it's so highly convoluted is to give us more surface area, okay, for the messages to be sent and for different connections to be made between the neurons that are in there. Okay, the cerebral cortex is a thin layer that covers each hemisphere, and it's made up of gray matter. So there's no myelin around the axons to speed up the messages in there. And there's also no chance for regeneration. Okay, we said the two hemispheres are joined by the corpus callosum. It is made up of white matter, and Like we said, its job is to carry messages, carry impulses from one hemisphere to the other. Another term that you should know and jot down is fissure. And that's just, see where all these, where it's all kind of have the different coiled up regions? Well, there's little pockets, kind of where it goes down in, little invaginations, and all of those are called fissures. So if you were to have a stroke on the left side of your brain in a region where it's looking after voluntary movements, okay, because the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, the movements on the right side, then it would be the right side of your body that would kind of probably look like it's paralyzed on that side, at least temporarily. So if you're looking for signs of a stroke in a person, um, if you're not sure what stroke means, stroke, there's two different kinds. There's one that's caused by blockage. That's called an ischemic stroke. And that might be that maybe there's a tumor there pushing on a vessel and closing it off, or maybe there's a clot that's gone up into your vessels in your brain and it's gotten lodged there. But somehow something has caused a blockage so that the blood and oxygen and nutrients can't get through to give the oxygen and nutrients it needs for the tissue in that region. Okay, the other kind is caused by a bleed. So if something happens that there's a bleed in the brain, then that can cause a stroke because the tissues that would normally be supplied oxygen and nutrients by that vessel aren't going to get it because the blood is going out of the vessel. And there's not much room in there between the brain and the skull. So it can be really, really, um, really hard for them to fix when there's a bleed in the brain. Okay? In either case, means that the tissues in that area aren't getting oxygen and nutrients, and those tissues could die because they need to have oxygen and nutrients in order for the cells to work, to function. Okay, so a stroke may just be temporary for some if they're able to get to the hospital quick enough and have them reverse the signs or reverse the the damage caused by the stroke. So it depends on the type of stroke and where it's at, how successful they can be, but hugely on how quickly the person is gotten the help that they need. So some of the signs that you might see if someone has a stroke are that maybe they've lost like their muscle tone, they've lost their um, ability to move on one side. So if they're not moving, or if they've kind of gone limp on the right side, it means that they have a blockage, or the stroke itself, maybe there's a bleed or blockage, it's on the other side of the brain. Okay, so some things that you could look for to see if maybe someone has had a stroke, maybe one side of their face is kind of drooping a bit, or they might have slurred speech because normally that would be controlled by a certain side of your brain. Okay, if they raise their arms, if you ask them to raise their arms, then they probably won't be able to hold them at the same level. One would probably be lower if they can lift it at all. If you ask them to write something with both, like each hand, then one hand's probably not going to be able to hold the pen or move it very well. So that that's kind of how it works with your brain, because the left side is controlling the right side in terms of movement, and the right side is controlling the left side in terms of movement. All right, so on the back side of your sheet, you are asked to label the lobes of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so divided in, yours doesn't have color. You're welcome to color it if you want to. Okay, so if you look, the easiest way to look and orient it is to look for that part of the brain that looks kind of like a bush. So this part down here kind of looks like a bush if you were to cut through and see the cross section of it. This is the cerebellum, right? And it's at the back of the brain. So up here is the front of the brain. So easy name to remember is the frontal lobe, right on. Okay, and the frontal lobe is responsible for your intelligence, personality, voluntary movements, so that includes speech, movements that you need to have in order to form words and speak. Okay, all those things are looked after by your frontal lobe. Oops. So controlling the muscles that give you facial expression in your emotions, that kind of thing. Doesn't have governing over all of your emotions, but it helps you to kind of show your emotions. Okay, so let's see. The one at the back, probably easy to tell. Okay, the one at the back was the one that looks after your sight, your vision. So that's the occipital lobe. Now, if you feel on the sides of your head, okay, if you have a headache, sometimes you rub your temples. Okay, so this is probably an easy way to remember. The temporal lobe is located just inside of there. Okay, along the sides of your head are the temporal lobes, and they are close to what sensory organ? Right, your ears. Okay, so your temporal lobe is important for hearing. It also has the hippocampus in it, and the hippocampus is important for memory. So learning and memory, and it also helps to look after your emotions. So these ones up in the top sides, okay, they're kind of at the top of your head and to the sides. There's one on each side. They are the parietal lobes. And the parietal lobes are important for interpreting temperature, okay, touch, taste, and to a certain degree they help a bit with emotions as well. Okay, so the parietal lobe is kind of interpreting information that's coming in from your skin, temperature, taste, touch, those receptors that we talked about. And taste is coming from obviously your tongue. Yep, great. This is the one that was in your book, so it's kind of a little harder to figure out exactly what the different parts are looking after. And if you look, the lobes are divided into kind of sub areas or sub regions, and I don't expect you to know all of those, okay? I'd like instead that you'd kind of have a general idea of what the lobes are looking after. All right. This is showing a picture of a brain. On the left side is a normal brain. On the right side is someone who has advanced Alzheimer's. So if you know or have seen movies maybe or know of someone who has Alzheimer's, it can be a very debilitating disorder. And what's happening inside of them is that the cerebral cortex, their brain, is shrinking. The cells are dying around the outside. So if you imagine your memory is looked after by the cerebral cortex, right? Um, so if that part is shrinking, then gradually your memory is going to become lost. So I'm going to show you, there's actually a link already on the blog that describes the disorders and procedures more for any time you want to look at them. But this is a little video on the brain bank. There's actually a brain bank, so for studying how the brain works. Hopefully this will show up okay for you guys.
The completely true and not at all made up story of how viral video was made. Professor Zarko spent months p.m.
Ooh, no, no.
A typical work night for Luis Fernandez. Earlier today, some precious cargo arrived. It's been chilling on ice all day. In that box is a recently deceased, freshly packed human brain. About all we know is it's a male, it's in its 70s, and if it's not preserved within the next hour or so, its quality will start to decline. For the Harvard Brain Tissue Resource Center, also known as the Brain Bank, this is one of over 7,000 brains. It's by far the largest brain repository in the world, a veritable stockroom of intelligence, packing freezers and lining shelves. For more than 25 years, the Brain Bank has been collecting and doling brains out to neuroscientists looking to unlock their secrets.
These numbers represents a donor.
Francine Venice is the Brain Bank's director.
To find more effective cures, we simply have to study the brain. There's no other way around it.
The problem is there are never enough normal brains to go around, and they're a necessity for science. The Brain Bank receives 300 or so brains each year, but only around 30 are considered normal. That means demand is high. First, Lewis separates left brain from right, preserves one half in formalin for later anatomical studies, then moves on to the other half. He removes all the critical parts, brainstem, hippocampus, amygdala, and precisely sections off the rest of it.
This is just cortex. Just cortex.
The brain lab looks eerily like a kitchen, but it's not the spectacle one might expect. Finally, Lewis freezes away all the samples to keep the proteins and DNA fresh for genetic analysis. Then histologist Tim Wheelock takes over. This is an Alzheimer's brain.
Just looking at it, we know something's wrong.
This one's normal.
A normal brain, on average, weighs about 1,400 grams.
Just over 3 pounds.
An Alzheimer's case, 800, 900.
Less than 2 pounds.
Actually, shrinking. You've got neurons, billions of neurons dying.
Now granted, scientists can do similar comparisons without the hassle of removing someone's brain. Brain scans like MRI and PET scans can tell us if the brain has shrunk. They can even watch it at work to show which areas of the brain have problems. But they can't do what Tim's doing now.
This is what happens when melanoma gets into the brain.
And that is to peer inside the brain cells.
You can't do any research on the tissue because you really don't know what it is.
For now, this is the only way to get those cells, and the only way to fully understand what's really wrong or right with the human brain.
Well, hopefully that wasn't too hard to watch. Wasn't as smooth as would be nice, but at least you get the idea. Okay, so we do have some technology now that allows us to kind of see how active the brain is during certain activities or what part is important for like what functions, things like that. But we're still, because we need to have specimens from, well, we can't take a sample of someone's brain who's alive because that can cause them to not be able to function properly. So we still rely on studies once people have died and donated their brains for research. So these are just shots taken to describe 4 different methods that they use to kind of study the brain and do tests on the brain to see what might be going on. I don't expect you to know a lot about them, but to recognize, what kind of information you can get from them in general. Okay, so if they hook your brain up to, or your head up with electrodes, so they put like pads on wires and they attach them to your head, then they can measure the electrical activity that's going on in your brain. This is called an EEG, or an electroencephalograph. Okay, they can also do this with your heart. So they would have pads placed in different regions on your chest. and back in order to monitor the electrical activity of your heart. Okay, but this is in particular for monitoring electrical activity in your brain. So if anyone's ever had to have a sleep apnea test, or if you had difficulty with sleeping, sometimes they'll hook you up to one of these and monitor you through the night, sort of thing, too. Okay, so that measures the electrical activity, and what you get is either a paper printout, or they can show it on a computer screen, the waves that are generated by the electrical activity. And those patterns can show if there might be something wrong with your brain. Over here on the right, this is pictures from CAT scan. And basically a CAT scan or CT scan allows them to do three-dimensional x-rays. Okay, so there'll be a grayscale picture, but not just in 2 dimensions like when you go for a typical x-ray, but they would get a machine that goes all the way around you, and it can give you a 3D image of different tissues, not just your brain, but other things if you had to have it done. Okay, down here on the right, an MRI can give you similar pictures to CAT scan. MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. So from the name, you can tell that they will subject your body to a great big magnet. So if you had surgery at one point and they had to put pins or screws or anything into you, or if you have um, belly button rings or those kind of things, then you have to be, well, they'd probably not be able to do it because the magnet would be strong, and you've probably seen it in shows. It's pulled things out through the skin. Okay, so it's where they expose you to a magnet, an external magnet, and it gives you a series of images, again, 3D images, but you can sometimes see different things in a different light. The bottom left is a PET scan. Okay, so PET scan is when they would give you a special dye that's basically it's labeled glucose. So glucose is our brain's main molecule that we use for energy to do work. So what happens is maybe they show you certain things, or they get you to do certain activities, and then they're trying to see what part of your brain is being active at that time. Okay, so if it's active, it's going to break up that glucose, and breaking up that glucose makes it fluoresce. Okay, so it's a special labeled glucose that you're taking in, so that when your brain is active in a certain region, then it causes it to light up, and you can see it on the screen. So it kind of shows, oh, well, this region of the brain lights up when you're hearing. Okay, so that is, well, that's the temporal lobe, right? Back here, occipital lobe. Well, that makes sense because that's going to light up when you're seeing words. If you're thinking about the words, then that's your frontal lobe that's busy working, right? And if you're speaking, then there's a certain region of the frontal lobe that's important for speech. Okay, so those regions will light up depending on what you're asked to do, and they can measure the activity. All right. Oh dear. Well, that was silly. The next page, I was going to get you to figure out the labels for the spinal cord, okay, the different parts and regions on the spinal cord cross section, but apparently I forgot to change it so it's not labeled anymore. So let's see if I, nope. Okay, so here we go. We'll just talk about it anyway. And you guys can label yours on your sheet. The spinal cord is the other part of the central nervous system. Okay, it's about 45 centimeters long. Am I going to ask you that number? No, that's just for interest. Okay, it extends from the base of the brain through to the vertebrae of the spinal column. So we talked about what's protecting it. The bone that protects it is the vertebrae of the spinal column. So if you look at a cross section, this kind of spongy looking stuff is actually super hard. Those are your vertebrae. There's an upper part and then there's a lower part. Okay, so that's one vertebra. In between the vertebra or vertebrae, so here's one and down here is another. In between them, so that the bone doesn't rub against the bone and cause pain, is an intervertebral disc. Okay, so when they say that they have problems with a disc in their back, then that is what they're talking about. Inter means between, vertebral means vertebrae, so the disc that's between your vertebrae. Okay, so you'd have one between each vertebrae along your spinal column. Now, the spinal cord is right here in the middle. You can see the butterfly, the gray matter butterfly in the middle. Okay, and it's found within what we call the spinal canal. So the spinal canal is this space that's in here. So you kind of need to keep straight what's the spinal canal, what's the spinal column, and what's the spinal cord. The spinal cord is that long nervous tissue that's part of the central nervous system. The canal is the space, and the column is the vertebrae, the bones that are along there that are protecting the spinal cord. Coming out from the spinal cord is the spinal nerve. Okay, this diagram over here is showing a bottom view of the skull. Okay, so there's an opening in the base of the skull called the foramen magnum, and that's where the spinal cord will come out through, and it'll be surrounded by vertebrae as soon as it comes out. Okay, yesterday we talked about the cross section and how you can see that butterfly or H-shaped region of gray matter that's surrounded by white matter, and around that, around here, we have the meninges. Okay, but we also have the cerebrospinal fluid, which helps to protect. What are its jobs? It connects the nerves of the peripheral nervous system with the brain, and it also controls certain reflexes. So we're going to get into talking about how your reflexes work. That's the next part. And your reflexes, like the whole reason for them is to help us to respond before our body becomes damaged. Okay, so it's a way that we can pull ourselves away from harm before much harm is done to us. Oh, this is just clarifying again the difference between the spinal canal and the spinal column and the spinal cord. So the spinal canal is the space that's around here. The spinal column is the vertebral column, so the bone that's surrounding and protecting the spinal cord. And this, I guess I said them all already. And this is just showing up closer. Okay, here would be the pia mater, the pink membrane, the meninges that's right against the spinal cord, which is shown in yellow. This is part of the arachnoid. Okay, it's the subarachnoid space that's got all those, looks like spider web in here. The main part of the arachnoid mater, and then the dura mater, which is a thicker one, which is right underneath it'll be underneath the vertebrae here. Okay, and the cerebrospinal fluid is found in here in the subarachnoid space. All right, so the reflex arc. Well, what is it? What is a reflex? Reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus. It's a no thought action, something that's going to happen without us having to think about it because we don't want to take the time to get the message to our brain and back again. Okay, we need to respond before there's harm done to us. Okay, so the arc involves, there's 5 things listed here, but really it also involves, we have to have a stimulus and a response. So we have a stimulus, there's a sensory receptor, okay, which has dendrites that are going to pick up the information that there's a stimulus there, a sensory neuron, which is going to carry information from the receptor to the spinal cord, an interneuron, okay, inter means between, remember, and that's going to connect or carry information between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So the interneuron is found within the spinal cord, okay, and it's going to carry information between the sensory and motor neuron. Then we have the motor neuron. The motor neuron carries information from the spinal cord back to the muscles. Okay, and in the case of a reflex, it carries it to the muscles. The effector is the muscle cell that's going to bring about the response. So it's going to react, it's going to be told to do something, okay, and it's going to cause the response, which is the last thing that happens. So, do we pull away before or after we feel the pain? Well, we're going to see. Okay, this is a diagram showing what's happened. Okay, so here's the stimulus. Sensory receptor is going to detect it. Carries information up through the sensory neuron all the way up into the spinal cord. Okay, here's an interneuron that's going to carry the information from the sensory neuron to this one, which is a motor neuron. Okay, the motor neuron is going to carry the message down to the muscle, which is the effector, and the muscle fibers are going to contract and pull the hand away as a response. Okay, so your job is to put these in the proper order. Can you do that? You guys can do them by just numbering. Okay, we'll go and maybe we can pause it just for a sec and then I'll show you the answers. All right, so first, the stimulus. Okay, we have a stimulus. In this case, the finger touches the tack. Second, the sensory receptor is going to detect that stimulus. Third, the sensory neuron carries information from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord. Next, an interneuron, which is in the spinal cord, carries info between or from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. The motor neuron then is going to carry the message to the effector and activate it. And then the effector, which is the muscle, is going to contract and pull the hand away, which is your response. Okay, so the point of this is to pull away from something that's harming you before harm or much harm is done. Okay, so because the message doesn't have to go up to the brain and be interpreted, then it can happen really fast. So that's how your reflex works. So because it doesn't have to go to the brain, this other line here, that's showing that there's another interneuron that's going to carry a message up to the brain and let the brain know what's going on. But this message would reach your muscle and you'd pull away before the other message even gets to the brain. So we tend to pull away before we actually register that something hurts and say, ow. Okay, so here's a little animation that shows it. And I think that's probably it. Yeah. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. So this is the last part for today's class. Reflex response.
Most of the time, the skeletal muscles are under voluntary or conscious control. However, their movement can also be induced by involuntary reflexes. Reflexes are involuntary reactions to a stimulus. In this example, the sensation of hot oatmeal on the skin, causes this man's hand to quickly withdraw to prevent further injury.
Ouch!
Let's look at an instant replay to see how this reflex response works. As soon as the hot oatmeal contacts the hand, the pain receptors send a signal to the spinal cord. In turn, the spinal cord sends a signal back to the arm muscles that make him pull his hand away.
Ouch!
Because the arm flexed as it withdrew, this reflex is really known as a flexor or withdrawal reflex. There are many other reflexes that protect the body as well. If this man didn't have the reflexes to let it withdraw quickly from a painful stimulus, he would be at risk for serious injury.
So, the moral of that one is don't make hot oatmeal or cook with no shirt on. Frying bacon is probably the worst one for that. Okay. If you'd like, you can read ahead a little bit about the peripheral nervous system, but otherwise, I'm going to turn on your online assignment. And otherwise, there's no real homework for tonight. You do have a urine lab that you need to finish and pass in, but because I wasn't there and may not be there today, or I guess I'm not if you're watching this video, I'll make it due next week. Okay? So, no homework tonight, but maybe you could have a look at the assignment that's online and pick away at a few of those questions. See you tomorrow, I hope.